Ranjit and I have known each other for like perhaps more years than we care to remember. He is young looking, I have signs of wear and tear. But I do remember that when the first time I saw Ranjit Hoskote, it was a byline. And I sincerely thought it had to be someone who must be in his mid-40s, who'd got a PhD degree from Cambridge, who'd come back and was taking up art writing as a little sideline while he lectured in anthropology, physics, and some other disciplines. And then I discovered it was this young man who was doing this writing. And then Zones of Assault came out, which was a book with the most unutterably ugly cover. Because I think the poor designer who read the book and then had to do a cover just couldn't figure out why it was called Zones of Assault. And inside the poems, inside other subtle streaks of violence and reflected violence, but there wasn't any violence in it. So the cover was like really a mishmash. But that was a lovely moment in the history of Indian poetry. 4 books of poems came out in a single burst of 6 months. And we all thought, now it's going to be settled down and we'll get a lot of poetry published. Didn't happen, but we got Ranjit Hoskote, which isn't a bad deal. Ranjit, take it away.
Are you trying to prevent me? It's been a long and marvelous friendship, and I'm really happy that we're here doing this. In Ooty, in the hills, in this fabulous library that I have occasionally thought to be a chapel in the course of yesterday. It's got a rather chapel-esque kind of air. About that cover, for my sins, it was an artist who I had, not been very kind to in a review. It was a long time ago, 1991. And I'm going to read now from my new book, Jonah Whale. It is Jonah Whale. I've overheard people call it Jonah Wale, which is absolutely wonderful in its own way. It could easily be Jonah Wale. This is about Jonah's people. This one's called Ocean. And one of the primary axes of this book is something that has gained great traction for me personally, as it has for many, many people now, which is our sense of the impending planetary collapse, the ecological catastrophes that surround us on every hand, which is why I warmed greatly, I responded very strongly to Pankaj Sekhsaria's amazing presentation yesterday. So here we go. Ocean. My name is Ocean. I shall not be contained. My tides spell starting gun and finish line. Afterwards, only shells and scattered roofs will remind you I was there. My combers wash away the roots of trees, towns, the shaken heart, but mortals, there's hope. My breakers hurl seeds back at your shores. After the flood, the chroniclers will write in Konkani, Sabir, Aymara, Tulu, Jarawa, Creo, Takbisin. After the flood, the beach exploded with giant peacock trees, in whose branches on windy days you could hear the surge and swell of ocean summoning whales, whalers who chased blood wakes, red-haired women who fought pirates, sleepless harpooners, who sailed from fjordlands to where volcanoes splintered the sleeping ice, furies who choked pearl divers, drove catamarans aground, voyagers who fell into the sea and grew wings, ocean reciting from his depths. Every drifting epic of pursuit, every song of shipwreck, every trace of raft and sail and trailing anchor, flotsam, jetsam, buckram, vellum, he could remember.
Begin, Ranjit, this conversation about a life in letters, a life lived in the middle of words and images, and words that spawn images, and words that respond to images, with where the first poem happened and when it happened and how it happened. And how did you know it was a poem?
I think most of us have had the same experience. It began for me when I was at school. And it was probably when I was 8 years old or so. And I knew it was a poem because essentially it came after reading a number of poems. And I said to myself, well, this is a form that appeals to me. At 8, of course. I said to myself very intelligently that, no, I didn't. I responded to the music of things I was reading. And to me, the musicality of poetry is an important starting point. I responded also very, very strongly to the way in which images sparked out of poems. So this visual quality of poetry has always been very important. And as we all do when we are children, I think those poems, those early poems, were derivative in one sense, but I would see them as early apprentice work. Because for me, as I concur with what Shanta said, the spark of inspiration is a rare and special thing. Most of the time, we are working with our hands. I see poetry as a very artisanal activity. We make poems. And the Greek word poiesis, from which poet and poetry come. Poiesis simply meant making a pot or building a wall or making a road. So one makes poems. I like to think of poetry as handcraft in some way. So but I didn't answer your question, probably.
No, I think it's in fact, sometimes it's as much of an answer as one can manage. No? It's like you're digging back, you're doing this kind of archaeological excavation into the self, and often it's difficult to know what you imagined about yourself and what you actually experienced. But what does it matter? Because it's one way of looking at that slightly alien being. Or at least for me, there are many selves with whom I wonder how I could ever have any organic relationship. So, listening to the poem from Jonah Vale, thinking about your Ghalib poem yesterday, thinking about that lovely poem that we put into Confronting Love, some letters are too proud to tell you that.
Some words are too proud to remind you they came.
Some words are too proud to remind you they came. There's a constant, I think, interest in the functions of memory and the loss of memory, the erasure of memory, the end of a notebook, for instance, sandpaper. Obviously there is and so, okay, that's what I wanted to say. Talk about memory, talk about amnesia, otherwise I'll babble on now.
I think memory has always been an exceptionally important fact to me, an experience. And this sounds a little, why wouldn't one want memory to be important? It's the foundation of our identity. But for me, it has other kinds of resonances. I think I may have said this yesterday, because I belong to this diasporic ethnic group. Memory, the memory of journeys, of things lost, of things gained, of living at the cusp of various languages, those memories have all been, that memory constitutes a very deep stratum of my work, whether it's in poetry or research of other kinds, or when I write on art. So, and increasingly now, in the last, say, decade, I've been possessed by this idea of anamnesia. Because we are living at a time when a certain kind of collective memory is being legislated onto us. We are being told that this is the past with a capital P. And both from my own experiential and existential ground, and also because of the kinds of things I'm interested in, I reject that completely. There is no singular past. There are pasts. One must always speak of pasts. For one thing, because the sources of our history are very, very varied. For another, because none of us are, we might be equal as citizens, but we all bring very different histories to this game of democracy. So when a Savarna looks at the past, that's one kind of past. A Dalit person looking at that same past sees something else. So you might be going on about your memories of prestige and privilege and so on and so forth. To the other person, it's a memory of horrifying tyrannical oppression. So there is no single past. So, and I prefer anamnesia to simple acts of remembering because it includes the fact that you can forget. That's an occupational risk. So trauma, the fugue, repression, articulation, all of these are different moments. The memory is a verb. It's not really a noun.
That's beautiful. I remember thinking when I first heard the story about Mandelstam's wife who memorized his poems and became a living archive of his poetry and then came to the West and published them, actually wrote them down. I think about Trachtenberg, the man who in the Auschwitz camps actually tattooed his system on his feet and on his hands so that he would remember it. I think of these acts of that all acts of memory are acts of heroism. And all acts, therefore, of capturing memory in some way are acts that are done against this tide of the moment, which is like actually biting into memory and taking it away. In your poetry, you often inhabit different selves. You often become a conqueror, a scribe, a poet, a dead poet, someone from the past. Are these also part of this attempt at imagining memory?
I think there are ways of reclaiming memory. And many of you know this legend. I'm a Kashmir Shaivite, so I oppose, and I'm not very fond of Shankaracharya and his Advait. The Advaitins here, I hope, will forgive me for this. But there's a marvelous story that Shankara has somewhere, which is that when he's challenged by a woman, by the way, a woman scholar, challenges him and says, there are experiences you've never had. You're a celibate, you're a brahmachari. What do you know of certain kinds of experiences you've never had? So he then vanishes, goes into the life of a king, a king who's just died. He inhabits that body and gains a variety of experiences he would never otherwise have had. And then he returns, Simple sounding story, but it's an amazing trope of how you could expand your own consciousness, your own imagination. And you can do that by assuming a mask, if you will. But the mask is a very empowering thing. It's not something you hide behind. It's something that you progress through. You become someone else. And I think that speaks also to the ways in which we can really release ourselves through empathy to the predicaments of others. So sometimes for me, this role-playing has to do with assuming a different kind of rhetoric, a different kind of language, because I also don't believe that any of us writes in a singular language. I mean, we use shorthand, we say English or Marathi or Kannada or Kashmiri or whatever it is. But especially when you're working in poetry, you're always recrafting and recalibrating that. So you're never really just writing some standard form. What you do in the body of the poem is something else. So these acts of reclamation help me with that. And in some cases, it's also just putting yourself out into a situation that you've been insulated from. And then you have, if you will, a certain ethical or even political empathy with the other.
So I'm going to take that moment, that word that you used, empathy, and ask, what is the role of empathy in translatory practice, in translation practice? Yeah. This is because Ranjit has done two separate and very interesting translations. One is Yoga Brasht, the Terrorist of the Spirit, Vasant Abhaji Dahake, where he collaborated with Mangesh Kulkarni. And the second is his magisterial translation of Lal Dyad. Did I get it right?
Lal Dyad.
Lal Dyad, okay. Who was a Kashmiri mystic who just defies all categorization. There's no way to talk about her. The only way is to experience her. Please go get Ay Lalla or learn Kashmiri and then start working backwards.
Translation, okay. Let me go back to the Yoga Brashta translation, which I did with a collaborator and a colleague, Mangesh Kulkarni. This was 1992. That came out of a very specific... Shanta, you're smiling at me in a way that suggests, you poor fool, why are you talking about this?
No, but also you have to read it because there is such an impress of Ranjit Hoskote on it. I remember the Via Dolorosa of Carrion Crows.
My God, I love that.
I just love it. I mean, the times when you're reading a friend's poetry and that friend is there in the words. Like that phrase is just captured and you think, only Ranjit could do Via Dolorosa of Carrion Crows while translating a Marathi poet. It's like, just...
Jerry, I'm glad you raised that. It also allows me to say a couple of things about modern Indian languages. Let me begin. Well, let me begin with actually the fact that I grew up in a very multilingual family. Really, I've written this somewhere. Up until the age of 8, I thought words like marmalade and toaster and so forth were Konkani. Belatedly, I realized these were English, because English and Konkani were spoken at home as interchangeable first languages. Nobody made a fuss about this. Then there were my cousins in the Air Force and the Army who spoke Hindustani. It was a beautiful Hindi that was close to its proper roots in Hindustani. It wasn't this peculiar Sanskritized Hindi that is passed off as one of our official languages. So I grew up in this cosmos of different languages without having to make a choice. I never faced this choice of what is your authentic language, what is your mother tongue. Mother tongue, I have to say, by the way, is a word that exists in no Indian language prior to the colonial encounter. Sheldon Pollock writes beautifully about this in The Language of the Gods and the World of Men. Matra Bhasha, and whatever that term is translated as in our other languages, is an invention. There's no such word in our own tradition. Because for centuries and millennia, South Asians have had multiple first language abilities. There was no reason to have. So home language, which Shanta proposes, is a word that I really prefer to use. So I had these two home languages, plus the Hindustani, and various other things, because each of my parents spoke about 5 languages, depending on where they grew up, Bombay Presidency and Madras Presidency. So that was my linguistic backdrop. Having said that, I went to this rather peculiar colonial-style school, which Shanta also went to, generations before, I have to say, where there was a strong Anglophony in play, right? So when I came to Elphinstone College, again, something we all share, it was a moment where, for the first time, I was face-to-face with people from very different kinds of backgrounds. And also with students who had gone to schools where the medium of instruction had been Marathi, for instance. So communicating with them was a very real thing. It had to be dealt with. So that set me off on this track of saying I need to connect with the language of the state, an important language of the city. And I thought, for me, as I'm a poet, it seems to be the best thing to do, to engage with the poetry of Vasant Dahake, who was actually an academic and a teacher at Elphinstone. And in that process, quick footnote to what you said, reading him and also reading Dilip Chitre, Vilas Sarang, Arun Koladkar, it came to me that the way in which the Indian languages, if you will, the regional languages had been presented to us was quite false. The idea that they were authentic and timeless and forever. The fact is that they've all gone through turbulent phases of change, of transformation. Each has its own modernity, each has had its own modernism. And I mean, you laugh about Via Dolorosa, but the fact is that there's one of the poems in the book, Dahake actually cites Ginsberg. And it's a very peculiar moment in translation when you read a Marathi poet who has a line from Ginsberg written in Marathi. How do you translate that back into English? So all we could do is bring him back into English. And
then there is well, what the hell.
That too.
Yeah, which works perfectly in Marathi, but when you put it in English, it's just like, well, what the hell is, like it's multiply confusing.
The original line was, oh ho, oh hell. But for our pains, there was a reviewer who hadn't read the original who said, literally, Hoskote and Kulkarni, in their eagerness to make Dahake sound modern, have put Ginsberg's words in his mouth.
Which also brings us to the notion of, when you're reading poetry, if you're reading poetry in general, there are days when you're reading poetry just lagatar, you're just reading it all the time, because that seems to be the way to be that day. And then you bump into a Ranjit Hoskote poetry, you feel that you've been walking in nice, slushy, sort of like water and mud, and then and there's this huge artifact of words, like, big, solid, beautiful construction. I'm asking you to reflect on your own aesthetic at this point in time, to look at your construction of a poem from a purely aesthetic point of view.
Again, I would thank you for the question, Jerry. Again, I recur to my idea that poems are made just as pots, vases, paintings, and sculptures are made. I see it as sculpting and language or improvising. A few years ago, I came to a point where I realized that I had very different commitments as an art critic and cultural theorist on the one hand, and as a poet. As someone looking at the visual arts, I was fascinated by the avant-gardes of the 20th century, the heroic avant-gardes of the first part of the century, and then the avant-gardes of the 50s, whose strategies were disruptive, they were improvisational, they involved collage and montage and assemblage. But my poetry was, and this has been said so I can say it of myself, it was much more classical in its structure and the way it came across. And I thought I needed to reconcile these two things, which I have to say, I didn't sit down one fine day and say, well, I'm now going to reconcile these things. It was just a question of opening myself up to what could be done on the page in terms of exploding the shape of the poem. That was one. Importantly also, thanks to the work on Lala, the 20 years that it took me to really think about Lal Ded and her work and her context, it came home to me very, very strongly that we have lost things, lost important dimensions of language on the way to print modernity. And you'll remember this old phrase which no one now uses, to reduce something to print. It really is a reduction, because when you move from oral culture and vocality to scribal culture to print, each time there's a kind of loss. It's one generation down. When you come to print modernity, there are many ways in which things you could do performatively, things that you indicate through the musicality of speech.